So I am Balazs Korossy-Khayll, and I'm a VP of engineering at BlackRock. So I'm not from EPAM. But BlackRock is the largest asset management firm company in the world. And so just to get an idea what that means, for example, BlackRock helps millions of people save for their retirements. So people trust their money and give it to us, and we invest that money in portfolios that yield a great return even in difficult market conditions. We also consider ourselves one of the most impactful financial technology companies as well. BlackRock's Aladdin platform is a collection of financial management tools that is used not only by BlackRock, but sold to many partners as well. As a developer, it really makes a difference to work for a company where technology actually, directly is bringing money, profit to the company. And we also work together to create new technology solutions with other companies like Microsoft. And we think that technology is the future of finance. So in the past year, we have been hiring a lot of developers. And I was really happy to see that many people are familiar with the latest frameworks. But because frameworks come and go, I think it's really important to be clear about the core features of JavaScript as well. And when people are stuck with explaining something, I often tell them to just try to draw a diagram for help. And in this talk, I'm going to follow my own advice. And I handcrafted to you some drawings that I hope will help you remember these things. Okay, so the first thing that comes to my mind is how powerful JavaScript is as a language. In fact, it's way more powerful than what we use it for, which is mostly web development. So in order to really understand JavaScript, we have to have this fun-loving, crazy, mad scientist superhero in ourselves. Did I miss something? But of course, we are not really appreciated. So let's get some obvious things out of the way. So the primitive types in JavaScript are string, number, boolean, undefined, null. Now, it's fairly straightforward. Some people do miss the distinction between integers and floating point numbers. And more often than not, people are not really clear why there's undefined and null. So, if you just look up the documentation, it turns out that a variable that has not yet been assigned has the value undefined. And if you want to explicitly indicate that there is no meaningful value for an object, then you use null. Right, so at this point, I'd just like to recommend the Mozilla Developer Network, WebDocs, which I think is really good place for information to complement maybe Stack Overflow. Because, as opposed to other programming languages, people kind of feel offended by when they are told to take a JavaScript course. And instead, how they learn the language, because everybody can program JavaScript, is by copy and pasting from various websites. But that's not a good idea, I think, because just think about how those codes were produced in the first place. It was probably copy and paste. And so, yeah, I think reading the docs sometimes really helps. And there's this other book. I'm not sure if you know it or not. If you read it, it's worth reading again. But if you haven't, it's a really good book about how the human brain works. And if you read it, it will explain you how we are biased to accept code from well-known places, familiar places, even though it's not always guaranteed to offer the proper solution. So by reading, you will be reminded to read the proper docs. Okay, so there's object, obviously, and then this newer thing, symbol. Well, symbols are very special. They are unique values, and there's only two operations defined on them. And this is how you create a symbol. Notice that there is new keyword there, so it's a static method, and it returns a unique value, the reference to this unique value, and that the unique in the apostrophes is the description of this symbol. Now, if you create two symbols with the same description, they're not going to be equal. And so the only way to access the symbol is by the reference. So let's take a look at this object. We have something unbelievable here. We have a private property in JavaScript. So I have here an immediately invoked expression that that hides this secret symbol reference to a symbol in a closure, and then returns a class. Now the class has a getter and a setter, and they reference to the secret symbol within the object. And so if you do these things, so you can create this new object, you can set the value of the secret, you can obviously get the value, but if you log out the own property names of this object, you will get an empty array, because symbols are not enumerable and they are also anonymous. So delete has no effect, it's still there. The only way actually, so it's not quite private, the only way actually to get these symbols is by the getPropertySymbols method. So JavaScript also has a global symbol table to store references for symbols. And there, in fact, in the language itself, there are these so-called well-known symbols, like this one. And these are quite handy because JavaScript has no concept of interfaces, and because we have to be backwards compatible, well, this is a way to have interfaces, because the symbols does not collide with the normal function names that you may have on the object. Yeah, so this one can come really handy when you're doing debugging. So instead of object, you can actually see what the object is. You can of course define your own global symbols and thus have your own interface. And another great way to do that is TypeScript, but it's only compile time. So another well-known symbol is the iterator, which is used by the for of loop. So you can, in your own class, you can implement this iterator with the so-called generator function. Notice that little star before the function. So generator functions are posable functions, and what that means is that it returns an iterator, and when the for loop calls the next method on the iterator, then the function will start to run and runs until the first yield keyword and will return the value. Now the next time next is called, then it runs from the second yield to from the first yield, to the second yield, and then from the second to the third. And in between these things, the context, the variable or the context of the function is preserved. So as you can see, I'm incrementing the chapter value, and this will be the output. So obviously, this is just an example, so it's not generic enough. I have hard-coded 3 chapters here, but I could do much better than that if I want to use that in a real-life situation. Okay. And yeah, one more thing that I found really interesting is that how far the IDEs have gotten. It reminds me that actually in the last yield, incrementing that variable has no use because I'm never going to use that value again, which is pretty remarkable if you think about it, because it understands that this is a generator function and I'm never going to be able to run it again. So quite fun. Okay, so when we speak about JavaScript, I have to mention the this keyword as well. And at first, I wouldn't start explaining all the different behaviors of this. Instead, what's important to understand is that JavaScript, as many other languages, is partly lexically scoped. And what that means, really, is that you can take a look at the code and figure out the value of this. So we have in the first two lines, I'm defining these two constants, and then I'm defining this sword fight constant, which is going to be the result of this immediately invoked function. And then I have a function within the closure, and then I'm returning an object. Now, this object has three properties. The first two are using this shorthand syntax, so you know they are referring to those constants at the beginning. It's just like I'm writing insult and double point and then insult, something like that. And then it has this function, which is then calling the other function from the closure. Now, as the parameter of this function, I'm giving this insult and this comeback. So when I'm calling this function, if you take a look at this code, you will know that, well, because it's an object, this is going to refer to the object, and then insult and comeback is going to come from this object. So you know what it's going to print. It's going to be those two lines. But JavaScript is also dynamically scoped, which means no matter how hard you look at the code, you will not be able to tell what this code is going to print, because in runtime, I'm doing this mass random, and depending on the result of that, either the first object or the second object is going to be the value of this. So the function is going to either print this or that. So you just can't tell. It's also the power of JavaScript, but it also can be dangerous. All right, so immutability is again something fairly simple, a simple concept, but it's important because a lot of frameworks make use of immutability and pure functions to manipulate the state and improve performance, because just checking for the reference or the primitive value is much faster than going deep into the object and checking for equality. So object.freeze is freezing the immediate properties of this object, and it's not going to go deeper. And that's not provided by JavaScript, but there's third-party libraries for that. Okay, so a couple of words about prototypical inheritance in JavaScript. So I was lazy a bit, and then I just created the last and the first dwarf here. And so the first dwarf has the last dwarf has its prototype, but you can imagine that if Snow White wants to get the lamp, then this will travel to the prototype chain, and finally the lamp will be given to her. So it's okay, right? The lamp has lamp property is defined on the last dwarf, but Snow White can still get it. What about the other way? Well, it turns out that setting a property is shallow, so it's not going to travel through the prototype chain, right? The first dwarf, even though there's no kisses defined there, when I set kisses, it's going to just set that kiss on the first dwarf, and the other is going to be pissed off. So prototypical inheritance, if you say that, then that kind of implies that there's another kind of inheritance, which is the class-based inheritance, for example. The classic example is Java. Now, there's a lot of differences, but I just want to point out one very major difference. In class-based inheritance, the superclass cannot be changed dynamically. And it's more like a template that is used to create the object. And in contrast, in JavaScript, you can do, such things. And although we have this class keyword in JavaScript, it's just syntactic sugar. So if you take a look at this class definition of smart guy, it's pretty much the same as the first thing there that I have. So the function soldier is a constructor function, and I'm doing something there. I'm logging the new.target. And so if you take a look at these lines here, you see that when you create this prints instance, it's going to write to the console function prints, which means that the new.target has this value. And then, of course, you can invoke this function, and it's going to return sword. So here's the trick. You can change the prototype of prints to smart guy. And then if you invoke the function, it's going to behave differently. So, that's the power of this prototypical inheritance. And just to prove my point, if you console log the type of the soldier, it's a function. If you would do the same with smart guy, it would also return function. And you can call soldier, and it's going to log undefined because that new.target is not defined if you just call it as a regular function. If you call it with a new keyword, then it's going to have a value. So that is used when you write class, and actually the smart guy throws an error because it knows that the new.target is not defined if you just call it as a function. And here's a nasty thing that you shouldn't do. If you attach something to the prototype of object, like this function, then it will be available on everything, every object in JavaScript, because object is the superclass of every object, or super object of every object. So actually, if you read the documentation on MDN, it says the only reasonable use case is to write polyfills. So to extend the language with newer features. Okay, concurrency. So JavaScript is single-threaded, but things still appear to be running concurrently because of the non-blocking nature of JavaScript. So handling I/O is typically performed via events and callbacks. And so the application, when it's doing an IndexedDB lookup query or returning an HTTP request, can still process other things like user input. Of course, being JavaScript, there are exceptions. So the alert, of course, is an exception. It blocks execution until the OK is clicked. There's this other thing, the synchronous XML HTTP request, which also blocks, but some say it was by mistake. So where are we now? Well, at first we had callbacks, then we had promises, then we have async await, which is still a pretty cool thing. And then we have this reactive programming concept. So RxJS is just a library, and it's not part of the language, but it's widely used in frameworks, for example, Angular. So callbacks, promises, and async await is pretty much tackling the same problem in a more and more developer-friendly way. So let's go through them. So this would be a callback example.
Well, in this example, you can see that we're setting the callback function on this XML HTTP request, and when we're firing the request, it starts to work and then calls the callback. And within the callback, I have to do some error handling as well. So, well, yeah, it's not really nice, but it works. But if you have many asynchronous tasks that I chain together, then of course you will get this thing called the callback hell, which is just many functions referencing each other, and it's hard to follow, and we don't like it. So then came promises, which is much friendlier. So we have this fetch that returns a promise, and then when the promise is resolved, we can define this callback, and the callback will get the value, and you can do whatever you want it. You can also do error handling in a much friendlier way. And if you want to chain multiple of these things together, then you just write another then, and then so on. So it's cool. So async await, although this seems a little bit more verbose, I think it's also more easily understandable for the developers, because you don't have to deal with callbacks. You just say await, fetch, and then that returns, you get your variable set to the result. And you can use try catch to do error handling. So far so good. Now, RxJS in itself would fill a whole presentation. So I just want to point out some key differences here. So RxJS can do more than promises. So I needed to change my example a bit. So similar to a promise, RxJS defines observable that you can use to retrieve the value of an asynchronous task. But promises can only deliver you one value or an error. But observables have 3 channels. So they can deliver you the data, they can deliver you the error, or observable can only also indicate whether it's completed or not. Now that's good, because observables can then return a stream of data, and this can be done actually in this case, because I'm not, so in this observable off line, with the off, I'm creating an observable from that array, and then I'm doing some operations on it, some error handling, and I subscribe, and then do something with the result that comes out after those filters. So in this case, actually, it's a synchronous code, but it could be asynchronous. It's synchronous because it's just an array, so there's no asynchronous things happening here. It could be off. In the off, I could put a promise, and then it would work the same way. There is one more important distinction. With observables, the execution only starts when I subscribe to the observable. So that means I can define my observable. I can define some operations on it. I can define the error handling, and I can assign it to a variable, and nothing will happen, even if I have a promise there or a fetch there that will fetch something from another web page or from the backend. The execution will only start when I subscribe to it. And because I can, decouple the observable, I can subscribe to it multiple times, and both subscriptions will get the data. Well, actually, this creates then a lot of possibilities in terms of operators for RxJS. You can do all kinds of things with the multiple subscriptions. You can join them, fork them, and I think just go and read the documentation. Okay, so as you can see, JavaScript is a pretty powerful language. Who would have thought that, maybe 10 years ago, that it's going to get this level of attention? And so I just want to remind you to feed your fun-loving, crazy, mad scientist superhero in you. Thank you. Yes, we have time for questions, I think.
Just one thought. The asynchronous
Yes.
HTTP requests could be also blocking.
Yeah, the synchronous, asynchronous.
The asynchronous as well can also block an abbreviated branch of requests.
Okay.
When you are initializing. Actually, it's because of the domain connection is limited. That's one of the. So you need to wait for the ones coming back in a limited bunch of requests.
Okay.
Afterwards, you can have the promises put forward.
Unless you do use CDN.
Queue, if you have a lot of in the queue,
Yeah.
it could also block.
Okay.
Pizza is not here yet, so
So you can.
entertain yourself.
Okay. Who loves JavaScript? Okay. Who hates JavaScript? Oh God. Yeah, there was a question there.
It was not a question, just a note. I think major difficulties with all the JavaScript frameworks, I have tested hundreds. The major difficulties is all the sites, what you are shipping with your product. If you look at the review point of view, for example, most of the time you are using RxJS, you are including Firebase and so on. And for example, Firebase is not well polished because it contains 1 megabyte JavaScript zip. And if you are loading in a web view, because we are talking about hybrid apps, then it costs 2-3 seconds. And if you are measuring the time that 3 seconds enough for a user just to leave your app, then it's fine. And I think that's the major problem with all the JavaScript framework, that it's just a dependency held and default.
Yes. Well, yeah, so the comment was that JavaScript applications can be slow to load because of the large amount of dependencies that need to be loaded. And yes, I agree that's a problem, and then there are multiple solutions or multiple possible attempts to solve that problem. By the way, RxJS, I think version 5 moved to this modular concept, and it's only including the operators that you're actually using if you're using this modern pipe way.
Can you please switch back to the slides where the secret is? Where the secret has secret things? Just interested in JVL.
No, not this one. This one. Yeah.
And the next one, when you're invoking.
Yeah, so because symbols are a newer type, they are not needed to be included in get own property names because of backwards compatibility. So you can hide them, and that's why there's this other method. Yeah. But it's since it's not this delete doesn't work either, so it's really good.
But it's also a leak that when you're asking whether there is secret property, get on property names return with without T.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not non-enumerable and anonymous.
Yeah.
Is there a real life usage of symbols?
But, so
How
I
are
think
you using symbol?
so. I think this is actually something that you would do. So if you want to implement, if you want your object to be iterable and not having to go through the properties in some way, then this can be really helpful. So yeah, actually you can go further. I don't have an example here, but you can yield an array with a star, and then it will just go through the array, and you will only have to include one yield keyword in the generator function. This is quite simple to iterate through an array within your object, and then you can use it in a for loop. Oh, yeah.
Are there any future changes to JavaScript but you are really waiting for?
Well,
A new language that is not JavaScript in the browser?
Sorry?
A new language that is not JavaScript in the
No,
browser?
I'm okay. I know I'm okay with JavaScript. I really like proxies. I just haven't really found the use for them. But I like a real life use. But they're really fun.
There is.
Well, there is, but maybe not that every day. But yeah.
For instance, making a client-side crawler for the REST API of some services.
Mm-hmm.
You can get through with a function. When the availability is, then you get it, and the REST chain. Get through with the base URL, and plus with the for half loop, you can get all kind of REST API endpoints and the responses.
Yes.
Just in a functional way. In a functional syntactic sugar around me.
Yeah. So the thing is,
demo.
yeah, the thing is that because of JavaScript is so dynamic, you can replace a function. So Zone.js kind of does that with all these asynchronous calls, and it's not using a proxy, it's just replacing the function, and you can still pretend it's the same old function, but it's doing something behind, that you don't know of. So there's most of the time you can just replace a function instead of using proxy. Where it comes handy is that you can have the hooks for delete, for example, which you otherwise cannot do. So there's some use cases.
Okay, you guys can continue this discussion during the break, but before the break we have another presentation, but first I would like to let's give a round of applause.
Thank you.